Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity. So the following video is a revisited video that I recorded for my Patreon supporters about a year ago. It's for the episode Q Who, where I revisit my review for Q Who. So it's a part of a series that I do for my Patreon supporters. Well, when I come up to an episode that I have already reviewed, because I'm going through every episode in order, but when I come up to an episode that I've already reviewed, I do a revisited exclusively for the Patreon supporters. So I decided to release this publicly now so everyone can see what I'm up to on the Patreon thing, and just so people can see it. I usually try to pick the revisiteds that I think are most interesting, or the ones that I like the most, and I release in public towards the end of covering the show. And I'm just finished season 6 of TNG and about to start season 7, so I thought I would release one from way back in season 2, Q Who, which I have some deep thoughts on this episode, maybe some controversial thoughts, because I don't like this episode as much as everyone else. But anyway, just thought I'd release it for everyone to see on my channel, so please enjoy. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's revisited for Q Who. Q Who. Anyway, so my original review for Q Who was uploaded to my channel on May 22nd, 2018. God damn, I hate how time is flying. That's already like more than 5 years ago. Jeez, 2018. And to be honest, while I was watching this video, I'm not feeling particularly well right now. I'm having a lot of health issues. So while I was watching this video, I was pretty fixated on how healthy I look and how great my background looks. But anyway, enough narcissism. So first thing I want to address, first of all, with this episode, Q Who, before I talk about anything else, is something I neglected to mention in my original review. Now, I say part of the whole point of me doing these revisits is to bring up things that maybe I didn't bring up in my original review, and I left out something very important that I didn't mention at all in my original review, so I gotta address it head on, and that's Sonya Gomez. I didn't even talk about Sonya Gomez. So the opening scene with Sonya Gomez, where she spills hot chocolate over the captain, like, that was a well-written scene, and I think that was a good character moment, but it confused a lot of people, especially people who go back and watch this episode in particular because it's so well-liked. It seems out of place. Like, I remember hearing opinions from people who saw this episode for the first time. They were expecting Gomez to come back and be an important element of the episode, that she was going to die, or that she was going to fuck up or something, or interact with Q, or kill one of the Borg, or something, that she was going to do something. So they felt that it was very jarring to have this scene there because it didn't really have anything to do with anything. And the thing is and if you look at this episode in isolation, I get that, and I can understand that perspective. But this was meant to be an introduction to a reoccurring character. And if you look at it from that perspective, then this makes a lot of sense. Now, granted, this could have been in any episode, but, why not this episode? I think it fits as well with this episode as any. And I think it was a sort of a nice sort of narrative device to have her and Geordi sort of conferring throughout the episode. So I think it works for the episode. But I can understand why people feeling like this was out of place, because she doesn't become a recurring character. Now, she does. I know that she does appear in one more TNG episode, Samaritan Snare, which that's an episode I've barely seen, and it's been a long time since I've seen it, so I can't remember off the top of my head how much she appears, but I know she does. So that's something I'll cover when I cover that episode next. But that's it. That's the only other TNG episode that she appears in. Now, of course, she also recently made an appearance as Captain Gomez in Star Trek Lower Decks. The episode, which I can't believe the episode's actually called First Contact. Like, how many Star Trek episodes and movies are they going to name First Contact? I forgot about that. But anyway, I went back and just watched that episode again, just to get reacquainted with what they did with Sonya Gomez. I believe they did, in fact, bring that actress back to voice her. And it was meant to be a sort of celebration of Lower Deckers, because if you look at it, she is very much in vein of Lower Deckers, such as with the TNG episode Lower Decks in season 7, and of course with the show Lower Decks. She fit right in with Tendi and Boimler and all of them, and so I think it made perfect sense that they would pay homage and show that she became a captain, show that she got promoted, and she was a very good captain too. She was a very humble captain, like a lot of other Starfleet officers. Like, she's in charge of a more important ship than Freeman's California class, but she was very gracious to Freeman, and of course Freeman eventually saved her life because of it. And they made her a very heroic and good captain. And Lower Decks can sometimes make characters not come off the best, to put it mildly, in service of comedy, which is fine. But I noticed in this episode they made a point of making it clear that she was a good captain, and they even had this fun scene that was a callback to this episode where this young ensign tripped and fell on Captain Gomez, and she was so embarrassed, and Gomez was like, "Don't worry about it. I've done worse things to, more intimidating captains," and of course referencing her spilling hot chocolate. And I think that was actually, even though it was an obvious nostalgia bit for Q Who and people who've seen it, I think that was a nice sort of, it was good to see like a future version of this character and what she had learned, how she looked back on this event that I guess in the timeline would have been over 15 years ago. Probably longer, I would say, wasn't it? I don't have my timeline thing out, but anyway, now there's other characters I've been complaining that I think Lower Decks should also show being a captain, like Harry Kim or someone else. I mean, because Sonya Gomez can become a captain, Harry Kim's got to come on. But anyway, so yeah, but getting back to, so Gomez was supposed to be a recurring character, and she was supposed to be a love interest for LaForge, and to be honest, I think it was a huge mistake that they didn't go this way. I think this is a really missed opportunity. I think this character really worked, and again, I don't remember how well she worked in Samaritan Snare because I've barely seen that episode. It's been a long time. No, I'm not going to go there. But I've seen this episode dozens of times, and so I'm familiar with her from this episode, and I think she works well. I think she was a well-written character, a well-acted character. I think the actor does a good job. And I think it's a shame that they did. I never heard the explanation as to why they didn't bring this character back. Didn't make her a recurring character. I think, honestly, and this might be a controversial statement for everyone except for my sister, but I think I like her better than Barclay. I think she should have been a recurring character more than Barclay. Barclay, I don't have as big of an issue with Barclay as my sister does, but I can see the standpoint that he doesn't really deserve to be in Starfleet, and I don't really buy that he would get that far through Starfleet with being so antisocial. But with Gomez, she's also comes off as like being a bit sort of having, problems relating to the crew, but in a more sort of realistic, relatable way. and not as an extreme. And in that case, I actually think she would have been a better fit for the crew of the Enterprise. And giving Geordi a love interest, I mean, this is what they should have done. This is something LeVar Burton has complained about, the fact that they made LaForge kind of a nerdy loser who sucks with the women and instead like becomes a bit sort of creepy around Leah Brahms, which I'll get to that later. And so that was his big thing. Even to this day, he thinks that the writers screwed his character on was the way they treated his relationship with women, and that could have been fixed. That could have been fixed if they had a relationship with him and Gomez. Now, in this episode itself, they're friends, but they're not really sort of leaning in that direction because he's her superior officer. Yes, but I think they could have made it work. I think now they did do one love interest story for LaForge with Aquiel, which everyone hates. Actually, the thing that episode's decent. I'll get to it later, but I think it would have been much better if they had her as a recurring character and a recurring relationship for LaForge. I think this was a huge missed opportunity, and I don't know why they abandoned her. I think it was probably decided in season 2 by Maurice Hurley, so by the time Michael Piller took over in season 3, it was no longer a factor, and they didn't even consider it, and they're like moving forward and introducing new characters now. I'm not going to go back to someone else who was abandoned, but I still think that was a mistake. I still think Piller or someone should have looked at previous episodes, because Piller did watch every single episode of TNG when he first started. He did state that. So he should have clung on to, why does this character not appear again? Why don't we bring her back? Now, I've heard some interesting backstories about this actress, because the other thing she's most known as, which is a very unfortunate role, was playing the three-breasted woman on Total Recall. Which I was actually surprised to learn that was the case. And apparently she had issues with that role. They didn't really tell her up front what the role entailed. And apparently she was crying on set when she first got there. And apparently Arnold Schwarzenegger was being a creep to her. Now, this is all secondhand information I get, so I don't know this for sure. So don't take this take it with a grain of salt. I don't know if this is actually true. But if it is, then that's terrible. I mean, that's absolutely, I guess it shows the kind of terrible environment Hollywood was in the 90s, although probably naive to think it's still not that way today to a certain extent. But yeah, that's absolutely should not be ever allowed if that was the case. And I can totally picture Arnold Schwarzenegger being creepy, by the way. I just don't want to go there. Anyway, so, yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about Sonya Gomez. I really wish that they kept her as a recurring character and made her a love interest from Geordi. I see that as a huge missed opportunity for the show, and I'm at least glad they brought her back in Lower Decks. I think that was they treated her very nicely in that, and that was a nice tribute. So, let's talk about the rest of the episode now. Q Who. So, when I decided to watch this, I didn't decide, but when I knew I was going to watch this for my Revisited that was coming up, I tried to get into a particular mindset, because I'm sure you all know, you're Patreon supporters, you know how I feel about this episode. You know that I think it's incredibly overrated. And that is nowhere near as good as everyone else thinks it is. So when I was coming to watch this episode again, I was literally I made a conscious effort to try to put my predetermined biases about this episode aside and judge the episode on its own merits. And actually trying to come from the mindset of trying to see what people who love this episode see. when they watch this. In fact, I watched a lot of reviews from people who love this episode to try to sort of understand like why they connect with this episode, why they think it's one of the better episodes. In fact, I just watched this review. Steve Shives thought this is one of the best episodes of the entire show. And so I, instead of dismissing that, I was like, you guys are just crazy and overrating it, I tried to really take in on their perspective on why they like this episode so much. In fact, I think this was originally a patron requested video from Allison. Allison, hello, if you're watching. And I believe that her original intention, because I originally said in some other video that I thought season 2 of TNG sucked, and she was like, well, what about Q-Who? And wanted me to talk about it, and I answered her privately saying, I don't like that episode. I think it's overrated, but she still wanted to hear my thoughts on it and still wanted me to review it anyway. But there's a lot of people, and I talked about getting discussions with Alyssa about this episode, who I don't think she would say this is one of the best of the show. I can't remember if she placed it in her top 100. I gotta go back and look. I'm pretty sure she did, but anyway, it's not in her like top 20. But she did like this episode a lot better than I did, as most people do, and so I tried to take on that perspective. And to be honest, when I was a teenager, when I was 12, 13, 14, when I was first getting into Star Trek, I considered this one of my favorite episodes. This was an episode I watched repeatedly because, but I talked about in my review how looking back on it now, it was phantom menacing. I was telling myself I liked it just because everyone else did. And I think it was. I honestly think it was, because these issues that I have with this episode, I've always had them. I just never really articulated it, and it was never it was always in the back of my mind hiding. It was never in the forethought of my mind the way it is now. But anyway, so when I watched this episode just now for this revisited, I tried to come in with the mindset of trying to be totally fair to it, trying to see what other people saw and why they liked it. And I'm honest. I mean, and I think I actually put in an honest effort. I don't think I half-assed it. I think I honestly tried to be fair and judge it on its own merits. And honestly, I just ended up reconfirming everything I already thought about this episode. I tried to see what other people saw, but I think the other thing that I wanted to be, take into account is the fact that I'm watching TNG in order, in context. I think because when I did this review originally, I watched it, of course, completely out of context. In fact, it was I was doing the movie reviews at this time. I even talked about how I was going to review First Contact the very next day, so it was like completely out of context. So I was wondering what impact watching season 2 in order would have. And I've done like the season-long reviews before, where I watch the whole thing in order, but that's very different, because I just binge watch the season like all at once, and I go back and do like 2 to 5 minute blurbs on each episode. So it's a very different thing, I think. And it's hard to explain, and sometimes I'm a bit self-conscious about trying to explain it sometimes, because I don't want to come off as pretentious, but it's very different for me anyway when you're doing these deep dive reviews on each and every episode. And I think any other Star Trek YouTuber, podcaster, or reviewer would say the same thing, that it totally gives you a different perspective, because even doing those season-long reviews, I just binge watch it, think about it, and move on, which is how a lot of people would view it, whereas doing each episode as an individual review or revisited, I watch the episode, I think Lore Runner refers to this as analysis mode, and I said that once, but then I felt self-conscious, like I was copying him or ripping him off. So I just say, watching it being analyzing. I think analysis mode is an appropriate way to say it, because it's a different way of watching, really, that you're sort of analyzing everything. You're not just sitting down and binge watching a show like I do actually with most shows, even modern day shows that I do review. But it's different for something like this that I've seen a billion times and I already know. And so when I go back and been watching each and every episode of season 2 individually, analyzing it, and going and watching a whole bunch of other reviews, finding out background information as much as I can, going to Memory Alpha, or finding out the history and reading some other backstory that might be relevant to the episode, seeing other people talk about it and their deep dive perspectives on it, and then going and talking about it on video for 20 to 60 minutes or however long it may be, and that really gives me a different perspective on the show, rather than just sitting there and binge watching it, or even going through and just casually watching different episodes. And I think so. I was wondering what kind of impact that would have going through season 2 on this episode, and honestly, it made me think less of this episode. And here's why. Because I'm noticing a pattern, and this is something I talked about in my review with Pen Pals, which from my perspective I just recorded a couple days ago. I know my patrons, like 5, what do we call, O'Brien and Cisco level supporters, probably saw that video a couple weeks ago. But anyway, the thing I notice is the writing in season 2. And this is also, again, I talked about this in the Pen Pals reviews, doing my research on season 3 writing, and just the writing in general on the show, and comparing it, is giving me a different perspective on exactly just how bad the writing was in season 2, and what exactly Maurice Hurley's downfalls and the writing staff's downfalls was with season 2, because I'm starting to notice patterns. And this is something I brought up, in Pen Pals, that there's a lot of cases where we had 3 episodes in a row, Time Squared, Icarus Factor, and Pen Pals, that all seemed to be great ideas that were not executed as well as they could be, to varying degrees. Time Squared was close, Icarus Factor was complete misfire, total bullshit, and Pen Pals was not quite there. It had too many issues, but not as bad as Icarus Factor. And Q-Who's not as bad as those two either, just to be clear. But I would put that in that same category of a misfire. Now, I think there are certain elements of this episode that you can tell are stronger writing, particularly the Gomez thing I already talked about at the start of the video. That was written well. You can tell if you compare that to certain scenes from the Icarus Factor or Pen Pals, you can see it's a tighter, better structured, more natural writing that works. You can see that they actually worked that scene a bit more and made it work. And, of course, other scenes in the episode as well. The way they did the Borg was by far the best, aspect of it. The way they made them, eerie and ominous, really worked. So I can see that this was a more tightly written script than some of the other scripts in season 2. But I still see some of the inherent problems with the structure, with them not spending enough time on the episode. And with Q Who, I did mention this over my overall feelings in my original review, is that I think the Q element does not work. I think this was a bad way to introduce the Borg, and I 1000% stand by this. So let me focus on Q for a moment, even more so than I did in my original review. Because I think this is always what I didn't like about this episode, or why it didn't connect to me. Because the whole point of it was Q comes on board, he wants to be a part of the Starfleet crew, and when Picard turns him down, he says, well, you're arrogant and you're not really prepared for what's out there. And Picard's like, well, you know, we can't be prepared for everything, but I think we're resolute, you know, we're determined, and your help is not required. And so Q, out of spite, flings them in front of the Borg ship. They are not prepared for the Borg. They get their asses kicked. 18 people die, and the whole ship nearly gets destroyed until Picard has to humble himself and be like, oh, you know, I was wrong. We were being arrogant. We need you. I said we didn't need you. I was totally wrong. We need you. And Q, you know, is able to save him because he was able to humble himself like that. And there's several issues I have with this storyline. Many things that, and this is the heart of the episode, and this is the heart of what doesn't work for me. First of all, I don't think Picard's being arrogant. And it's because some of the reviews that I've watched and other opinions I've seen on this episode say, oh God, they're so fucking arrogant and Q's putting him in this place. I don't agree. They don't like Q, and they have good reason not to like Q. You gotta, again, you have to remember, at this stage, his Q's only appearances ever in anything was Encounter at Farpoint and Hide and Q. All that stuff with Tapestry and All Good Things, that's late. That doesn't exist yet. Encounter at Farpoint and Hide and Q, in both cases, he is an arrogant, antagonistic prick. And this is something that Picard points out in this episode. He says, we don't trust you. And he's 1,000% correct not to trust Q. 1,000%. And so I think that was the bigger issue. Rather, oh no, we're arrogant, we're fine, we're going to be okay, we can handle anything that comes at us. That's not what Picard was saying. Picard was saying, you are an arrogant prick that we cannot trust, so you are the last person that I want to be by our side to face these dangers. And that is 1,000% the correct stance to take. Therefore, the episode's trying to tell me that, oh, he's being arrogant because he thinks he can handle everything out there, so he has to humble himself and tell Q that I was wrong, you're actually great. And that doesn't compute to me. That doesn't actually fit with what we've seen. I think that is incorrect. And on top of that, Q, why does Q want to be a member of the Enterprise? Like, I don't buy this. Like, what? I buy it more in Deja Q. They do such a much better job. Like, season 3 is just so superior to season 2 in, like, every way, shape, or form. Jesus Christ. I suppose if you compare Measure of Man to, like, something like The Price, then you could say is season 2 is better than season 3, but that's rare. like, it's just so much better, like, in every way. But anyway, yeah, why would Q want to be a member of the ship? Like, they don't sell that to me. And what makes it even worse, what sells it even worse, is the fact that at the end, when Picard humbles himself, why doesn't Q be like, okay, I just proved myself, now make me a member of the crew? Instead, he promptly fucks off. So why did he do, what? Like, what was the point? Like, I know people are going to come at me with, oh, his point was to prepare them for the Borg or whatnot, but that's not what he stated at the start of the episode. He didn't say, I'm here to prepare you for this big bad guy. He said, I want to be a member of the crew. Therefore, henceforth, bad writing. They established something as, I want to be a member of the crew, and they promptly dropped that storyline. Which actually never made sense in the first place. So there's my issue with this episode. The whole foundation of it doesn't make sense. And another thing I want to talk about, and maybe this is an argument I could have with my sister, I don't think he was justified in killing those 18 people. I casually, jokingly brought this up in the discussion we did, and then quickly tried to change the subject. I was like, oh yeah, Q was great introducing the Borg, and he got 18 people killed anyway, and then Alyssa objected, and she was like, oh, wait a second, Q was actually prepping them for it and getting them prepared for the Borg, but 18 people dying is a very serious thing, and they wouldn't have died had not Q thrown them in front of the Borg. If he wanted to prep them for the Borg, like, there's other ways to do it, which I think of 18. Do you know 18 people? Think of 18 good friends. What if they all died? Like, that's a big deal. That is a big fucking deal. And I don't think it's okay that he let 18 people die. Now, you might think, if you think of it from a different perspective, from the greater good, like hypothetical good needs of the many kind of perspective, well, what if those 18 people saved millions of lives? But we don't know that. I would argue against that eventually. I see no evidence for those 18 people needing to die for millions of people, because millions of people still died at Wolf 359. I don't see that those 18 people really saved any lives. So I do not at all excuse Q for letting 18 people die. His excuse of, oh, I'm getting you prep. And the fact that Q gets off scot-free, like, this is an issue. I think I might have brought this up in my Deja Q review, that when he came aboard and he was human and at their mercy, they should have arrested him and thrown him in prison for killing those 18 people. Honestly, I mean, that's honestly what I think. I don't think he did them any favors here by the way he flung them in front of the Borg. Now, this all gets back to, I think, this being sloppily written. This gets back to what I was saying about Season 2, because they had this idea for the Borg ever since the end of Season 1. And I talked about this in my Neutral Zone review, that the original intent was the Neutral Zone to be like the first part of a 3-parter that jumped into Season 2 that introduced the Borg, which I can't remember if they were still insectoids. I think they were just cyborgs by this stage. But because of the writer's strike, that was abandoned, but Maurice Hurley still had this idea of the Borg. And to be fair, his idea of the Borg was a good idea. Like, Maurice Hurley, I don't give him credit for a lot of things, but he deserves credit for the Borg. Like, he did a good job inventing the Borg, but he didn't do a good job introducing the Borg, in my opinion, because it was a very good concept, but they couldn't come up with a way. So it was already a while since this Neutral Zone thing, so they decided to use Q kind of as a crutch. As I said, it speaks to the fluidity of the writing in Season 2 and how nothing was nailed down. Everything was being played fast and loose, which, again, it doesn't excuse the bad writing, because Season 3 was the same way. Season 3, they were coming up with everything on the fly and it was being played fast and loose, and Season 3 is the best season of the show. So being rushed doesn't necessarily equal bad writing, because in that case it equaled great writing. But it shows that they weren't able to handle it, that they weren't able to fit everything together, because they were like, oh my, we want to introduce the Borg, how do we do that? Let's just use Q. Yeah, fuck it. Go for it. Who cares if it works? Just throw it together. And after, as I said, I'll say it, analysis mode. After paying close attention to this episode and previous episodes, I think it's very clear that that's the case. That it was just a crutch. Use Q because he already existed. He was a pre-existing character. Use him as a crutch to introduce this new villain, and I think that was a mistake. And because originally they want to have Q be, in this 2-part about Time Squared, and honestly, I think that might have been a better use of Q than this, if I'm being perfectly honest. Now, as I said, the Borg were a great idea, and they were definitely by far the best aspect of this episode. When I went and watched those reviews and those opinions of everyone who loved this episode, that's what they focused on. They focused on the ominous aspect of the Borg, how scary they were, how creepy it was, how effective it was, and that's all true. I agree with all of that. But it would have been better if the whole story worked with that and made that and focused on that and fit that better. I think the Q element ruins the episode. Because here's what I would do. Here's my pitch. I would have, let's assume, the writer's strike happens and we're like 2/3 the way, or is it 2/3? Around 2/3 or halfway through season 2. And neutral zone happened a long time ago. I still wouldn't abandon the idea of the neutral zone. I would tie it in. I would say something else happened. Like maybe there was another attack. Maybe not even in the neutral zone. Maybe like out somewhere else in the Federation outpost. Like out in the skirts. And they realized that it's the same thing that happened to the neutral zone. But it was like maybe it was the ship going outward. And so the Enterprise is sent to investigate. And while they were out investigating, and you see the scoop up the technology thing that was described in the neutral zone, and maybe they had gotten some intelligence from the Romulans. Let's reference that episode a bit more. Like, I know they mentioned it in this episode, but it made no sense. It fell out of place. It's like because they were flung to the Delta Quadrant, and they're like, oh yeah, these planets are identical to the things in the neutral zone. Like, how? Why? That doesn't make any sense. So in my version, it would make sense. They would explain it. They would tie it into it, and they would have the Enterprise purposely investigating what happened, and then they would come across the Borg. And you could do everything that you did in this episode with them being ominous, with the Borg coming on board, and them phasering and having the shield that they can't, the adapting, and they can't shoot through it, and Riker beaming on the ship and seeing the Borg babies. Like, you do all those same things, but you just ditch the Q element, which you really don't need, and you focus on them, investigating the neutral zone. Now, that would change the ending because you can't just have Q save them, and I think that's a good thing because that was too easy of an ending. That was too easy of a way to get out of it, and I think again, the writers have to challenge themselves more, which they just weren't able to do in season 2, and try to think up of a way to get out of this situation that's not just a Deus Ex Machina. Let's call it what it is. Q's a god. God, they're saved by God. And you have to be a better writer and more inventive to come up with a different way out of it, which is what they did in Best of Both Worlds. Michael Piller talked at length about how difficult it was for them to find a way to get their crew out of that situation. Best of Both Worlds Part 2. And granted, I'm not a huge fan of what they came up with. It's, reminds me of the computer virus thing from Independence Day, but it still worked. And so I think they would have had to work harder, but they could have come up with something else. They could have come up with, the Romulans, actually some of the information they gave us we thought it was useless, but it actually has this Achilles heel that we can use against the Borg, not to destroy them, mind you, but just to get away and disable the ship, and they fly away, and they're able to fight another day or whatever. Like that, to me, that would have been way better than a Deus Ex Machina. But that's just one example. Like, I'm not a professional writer. Professional writers are supposed to come up with something better than me, and they should be able to. And so, yeah, I think that, and then if you do it that way, you ditch the Q element, you can focus way more on the Borg. You can focus way more on the character stories. You can have more scenes with Gomez and tying it in. And I just think it would have been a way better episode. I think that they relied on Q as a crutch, and I think it hindered them rather than helped them. Now, in my original review, I talked a lot about the Borg and how different they are now. So I won't really get into that again because I've already, explored that, they're different. They changed them. The assimilation wasn't a thing at this stage. They were just going around scooping up technology, and how the fact that they considered the Enterprise ants made sense for this episode, but later on they kept that where Starfleet crew members can be on board and be ignored by the Borg, which doesn't actually make sense with the changes they made in the Borg. When they made the Borg about assimilating people, if someone be on the ship, they should be like, ooh, let's assimilate them. So it is so that doesn't fit. And I went on a really, really long-winded too, but a long rant about the political origins of the Borg, which I thought was a very interesting discussion, actually, and I haven't gotten any feedback. I don't know what anyone thought about that, but I stand by that the Borg, especially since, Roddenberry helped invent them, that they were originally created as an anti-capitalist sort of drone, corporate drone society, like the corporate mentality of you all must be like me. And I think the strongest one is the way that they don't really care about people, and they just scoop up technology and they steal everyone's resources, which is what a lot of a strong commentary, I think, for capitalism does in third world countries, that they put them in debt, they strip all their resources and send them away to rich countries for the greater good. So I think the Borg was definitely, and I've heard other people disagree and think I don't see how Borg works as a commentary on capitalism. But first of all, you got to look at it just at this episode and maybe Best of Both Worlds, because after that it wasn't anymore. But but for this, it totally was. They did change, especially Voyager is a full-on authoritarian communism. Extreme socialism, authoritarian communism commentary. I mean, that was obvious, but I think here it totally wasn't. It was actually capitalism, how they use resources. But as I said, I already went on a super long rant in my original review about that, so I'm not going to rehash that here, just to reassert that I stand by that. I think that's definitely the case. Looking at this episode again. But the other point that I want to make about the Borg, and I watched a review where someone else referred to this as a prequel to Best of Both Worlds, and I think that is a 100% accurate way of describing this episode. I would go as far to say that if Best of Both Worlds didn't happen, if the Borg never became like this really popular, exciting villain, no one would consider this one of the best episodes of TNG. No one would be looking back in this episode and saying, wow, that episode was amazing and I love it. I think it would have been forgotten. I think it would have been just another episode. I think the only reason why people love this episode so much is because of, in retrospect, because of Best of Both Worlds. And I really stand by this. And one of the main reasons, what I'll say to back that up, is this episode, and I talked about this a bit in my review, how it was kind of isn't that cool? Like, this episode was so written as an introduction to the Borg. Even though I say I love the Borg elements in this episode, it comes across as really creepy and ominous. It's obvious to me that they are introducing us to a new villain. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that. Like, a lot of sci-fi shows do that, but I think I don't know, it can come across as clunky. And to me, even when this episode first came out, before anyone ever knew what the Best of Both Worlds was, and there was no idea they were ever going to do it, this was still written as a prequel. This was still written as the introduction. Oh, here's a new villain. This is what they're about. Let us explain it, but not actually have a concrete story. That is... Because what is the concrete story in this episode? The Q bullshit? I already talked about how that doesn't work. So there's not really one. I'm sorry, but there's not. Now, let me talk about Guinan for a bit. I think this is something I didn't mention about Guinan in my original review, was when Q flings them over to the new space, and Picard and Riker go to Guinan, like, Guinan, your people have been in this space before. Tell us what to expect. What can we expect? And Guinan says something along the lines of, I can't tell you much, but except for if I were you, I would turn back now. What do you mean you can't tell them much? You know all about the fucking Borg. Your species was erased by... In fact, later in that same goddamn episode, she's telling him details about the Borg and what they are and what they do and how they function. Why the fuck didn't you say that in the first place? I am sorry, but that is bad writing again. That is because they wanted to make it ominous and mysterious for the viewer, but in universe, why is she withholding this information? Does she want them to fail? Does she want them to die? Does she want to just come off as creepy instead of actually being helpful and telling them, hey, there's a species here called the Borg, and this is exactly what they're about, and this is exactly what you can expect, so now you can come in prepared. But no, instead she just let them fumble around like a bunch of idiots because she wants them to die, I guess. See, that is bad writing. I am sorry, that is bad contrived writing. Plain and simple. I mean, no ifs, ands, or buts around that one. And then I already talked in my other review. I already talked about the whole Guinan like doing this to Q, like she can fend off his powers, and Q being like, "Keep that person away, Jean-Luc." Like, Q, did you forget you're omnipotent and all you got to do is snap your fingers to get her to disappear? Like, did you forget that? Or is this episode trying to tell me that she can actually defend herself against Q? That whole thing just makes me laugh. It's just, what are they doing? Like, what are they even doing with this writing there? I guess they're trying to make Guinan this more mysterious character, and to be fair, this is the first year they introduced her, so maybe they took her in a different direction. But in order for her to defend herself against Q, she would have to be pretty fucking powerful. She would have to be kind of omniscient herself, which was never implied before this episode or after. So what, like, just what? Like, this is, again, this comes off as like terrible writing for me. I'm sorry, but it does. Now, I'm not saying that I hate this episode, which you might get the impression, because I'm focusing on everything I don't like about it. But that's because everyone else focuses on what's good about it. I feel I don't need to bring out, like I mentioned before, how ominous the Borg are, how they work, how I like the Sonya Gomez writing, how some of the scenes are written very well. So I don't feel like I need to focus on those things because everyone else does. It doesn't mean I totally hate this episode, because there are good elements and I'll acknowledge it. But in an episode like this, which I feel is really overrated, I feel I need to focus more on the negatives more, because no one else is. Everyone else is already focusing on the positive. That I don't need to do that. But anyway, yes, I went back and watched my top 10 overrated episodes of Star Trek, and this is my number 3. I think this should have been my number 2. I would change that. My number 2 was Best of Both Worlds. And honestly, I would drop Best of Both Worlds further down the list. I think this is easily more overrated than Best of Both Worlds. And you guys know how I feel about Best of Both Worlds, but I still like that. Like, that episode I give a 9 out of 10 to. Everyone else would give it a 10 out of 10 and put it in the top 5 best TNG, which I wouldn't. I don't think it even made my top 20 TNG. It might make my top 25. But, so I definitely do think it's overrated, but whereas this episode, like, it's not a 9. Like, I wouldn't put it anywhere near. Like, this wouldn't make a top 50 of TNG. Probably not even a top 75 of TNG for me. Maybe a top 100, but of just TNG, mind you. Not of, like, if I did a top 100 of the entire franchise like Alyssa did, no, this episode would be nowhere near it. Nowhere near it. And, it could make a top 100 of TNG because there's, 170 some episodes of TNG. So, is it in the bottom 75 of TNG? Maybe not. I don't know. I would have to look at it. But, it could be because that's nearly half the show. So, I don't know. So this, I almost want to put it at number 1 most overrated episode of Star Trek, but then there's Trials and Tribulations. I had to give it to that. That's that's always going to be my number 1. But this should have been number 2. And if I would change that, I would change it so this would be number 2 in Best of Both Worlds. We'll actually probably drop further down to like 7 or something. I don't think it deserves to be number 2. I guess I'm learning to appreciate that episode more. I think I was just off-put by how everyone else loves it way too much, which is what I was hoping would happen with this episode, but that's not what happened. I actually just got more reaffirmed that this is way overrated. So, my original rating for Q-Who out of 10 was a 6. And I gotta be honest, even after all these negative things I've just said about the show, I was seriously considering raising it to a 7. Because here's what I was doing. Because I was looking at the other episodes that I rated in season 2. And what else did I give a 7 to? I gave A Matter of Honor a 7. I gave Time Squared a 7. So if I keep this as a 6, that means I'm saying A Matter of Honor and Time Squared are better than this episode. What episodes did I give a 6? I gave the Dauphin. I gave the Dauphin a 6. The Wesley Love Romance, Not as a Whisper, got a 6. The one where the guy is an arrogant dick and thinks he can solve everything just by because the shit smells like flowers, but he actually goes and gets everyone killed. That one I gave a 6. And then the Royale, I gave that a 6. The Royale, everyone hates that episode, and it's a cheesy, poorly written novel where Data is playing poker with Texas. So I gotta ask myself, do I think Q-Who is not as good as Time Squared, and is it on the same level as the Royale? And the answer I came up with after, analysis mode, after really analyzing this episode, was yes. I really do think that. I think that this is on the level of the Royale. I think that Time Squared is a slightly better episode than this. And I'll tell you why. Time Squared does not have as many issues with the plot. The problem with Time Squared is that it's too simplistic, and which is what I talked about when I reviewed it. In fact, that's why my review is kind of short for that, because I didn't have much to say about it, because there's not much to it, which is the problem with it. But it doesn't have the fallacies or inconsistencies that this episode does with the whole Q and Guinan storyline, and it doesn't come across as haphazardly put together in the same way that this episode does. And also, they both are successful in creating an eerie tone. But I gotta be honest, I think Time Squared does a slightly better job at it than this one does. I think the music, for one, is better in Time Squared. And again, this is a matter of opinion. I know some people have different opinions, but I love the music in Time Squared. I think that really fit with it, whereas I actually don't like the music in this episode. Now, I'm going to look it up now, because I haven't looked up yet, so I'll do it while I'm recording. Who did the music of Q-Who? I don't know, so this will be an interesting thing, because I already always talked about before, whenever I love music, it ends up being Dennis McCarthy, and everyone else seems to love Ron Jones, and I tend to not like him as much, but let me see. Maybe it was Dennis McCarthy who did the music for this. I don't know. It's going to be interesting, so I can find out, you get my live reaction on camera. as I find out who did the music. Let's see. It was la 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 la. Director of music by Ron Jones. Oh God, it was Ron Jones. Oh my God. So I'm sorry. I honestly didn't know that. I love the music. Look, I'm not going to say Ron Jones is a terrible composer because I love the music in Best of Both Worlds. I think he did the music for that. That much I know. That's one of the best scores of the show. But it always just so happens. It's just coincidence. It just shows just that I gravitate more towards Dennis McCarthy's music. I guess a lot of other people, like Laura Runner, tend to gravitate towards more Ron Jones music, and that's fine if you want to. But yeah, I personally thought the music in Times Squared was way better than the music in this episode. I'm sorry, but I did. I just did. But it still did a good job with an ominous feel of the Borg for sure. But which is why I'm not going to lower this rating to a 5. I think I haven't even mentioned yet, but yes, I am sticking with a 6. That is my ultimate decision. I did mention that, but yeah, I am sticking with a 6 for this episode. In fact, when I did my overrated top 10, I actually said I gave this episode a 5. Which I made after my original review. So really I lowered this to a 5, but now I'm coming back up to a 6. Because I think, a 5 is too low. Like, the Royale is not better than this episode. The Royale does not deserve a better rating than this episode. I'm not going to go that far. But on par, yeah. I mean, the Royale is a different beast, though, because it's meant to be a fun, lighthearted episode, and it succeeds. Does it have a few plot holes? Sure. But nothing that really drives a wedge in the plot the way that the Q element of this episode does for me. And maybe it's just my opinion. Maybe I'm the only one that feels this way. Maybe other people look at the Q plot and think, oh, makes total sense. Picard's being arrogant. Q's actually preparing them for the Borg. And Picard has to humble himself. That's a really good storyline. And, that's fine. If people have that opinion, nothing wrong with that. I just don't. I don't see it that way. I really see it that that's actually doesn't make sense and is not interesting to storytelling to me, and that they could have been avenues for them to introduce the Borg that would have been way better than this. And I think this is not a good Q episode. As I mentioned before, there is not a good Q episode until season 3. The first 3 Q episodes I think are all bad. But again, not saying this is a terrible episode. As I said, it still gets a 6 because of how ominous the Borg are and how some scenes are written well. But really, I gotta say, this is one of the most overrated episodes of the entire franchise. Nowhere near as good as everyone claims it to be. I'm sorry, after my trying to do a very objective, analytical view, that is my conclusion. Anyway, so that is it for my revisited of Q, who I knew this was going to be a long one, but that's all good. All in good fun. I hope you have enjoyed watching this as well. So just coming up next on the old schedule here, as I said, Samaritan Snare will be the next episode I covered, so we get to see what Sonya Gomez was up to. Another sort of precursor to Lower Decks with the Packlets. So that would be interesting to watch. That's, of course, going to be live on my channel. And then Monday, live on my channel again with Up the Long Ladder. God damn, Season 2. Fuck you. Anyway, and then on Wednesday, back here again, my friends, for another revisited. This time going outside of Next Gen, going back to good old Captain Kirk with What Does God Need with the Starship? keep telling myself, like, every single time I watch Star Trek V, that I'm never going to watch this movie again. It's going to be the last time I have to sit through this bullshit. And then, because of my dumbass and my YouTube channel, I keep coming up with more ways to have to force myself to watch that giant piece of shit. And, you know, I part of me is tempted to not watch it and just record my revisited on it without watching it. But I'm not going to do that. I just can't. I just can't. So I'm gonna force myself to watch it, so I can do another revisit. I hope you guys appreciate that. Anyway, and then next Thursday, another golden, great episode with the Manhunt. Jesus Christ. Oh my God, like season 2, season 2 is just so bad. I'm starting to change my mind, really. Maybe season 2 is worse than season 1. I think that's something I'm going to have to consider after rewatching it, because there are definitely elements of season 2 that are better. I mean, season 1 doesn't have anything like The Measure of the Man in it, but The Measure of the Man is still a bit overrated and not as great as everyone else says. And it has Up the Long Ladder, Manhunt, Shades of Grey is another one I have to look forward to. And I already did the Icarus Factor and what else is this bullshit in here? I don't know. I don't know if season 2 is better than season 1. I think when I do my ranking all the episodes of season 2, I'm going to have to seriously consider that. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching this video. Thanks for supporting me on Patreon, and we'll see you next time.